Okay, I just got a new camera, or I just bought, bought a camera. Someone gave me a camera. I'm borrowing a camera. I'm taking this class, and I look at the camera, and I don't even know where to start. Right? It's got P on it. It's got a movie camera picture. It's got scene modes, and it doesn't have white balance directly. I don't see white balance setting. I don't see ISO setting on here. And but I do see a flower, which I know that's macro. I see a flash symbol, but I do not see what some things that I think I need. So in this particular camera, I would really struggle if I was learning, and my teacher's telling me to use white balance or change your ISO. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is pause now or pause in a bit. But what you really want to do is go out and look for your white balance. Go out either to a website, Google it, your camera, or look at your manual, find your manual, and also really look at your camera carefully through the menus. But there's usually a button you push or a combination, and that'll bring up the white balance. Let's do that first, your white balance. And so you really do have to know that, or you will be crippled in learning how to take photos, because it's a fundamental. And if I really wanted to break these down into categories that I'll try to use most of the semester, will be most of the decisions you're going to make with these cameras. Your camera will be in a category of practical, or let's say the reality of the situation, right? Reality and practical. It's just going to be that's all one grouping of the nature. It's just going to be almost common sense once you understand how the camera works, why you'll pick something. So it will really become a lot of decisions once you understand how things work are actually very easy. The next category, which would be the next level, or the highest level actually, would be artistic and creative decisions, right? Artistic is you have an idea, or you've seen an idea, or you imagine something, you want to create a ghosty image, or you want to create just some dramatic effect in your camera. And it's always better in the camera than in Photoshop, because it will look more natural, and it will be more, you'll be able to do more with it even afterwards if it's right on the image. So artistic, creative decisions that's the ultimate goal, is making artistic decisions. And but practical, we'll talk about both of those, but a lot of decisions won't be as complicated or scary once you know where the few choices are in your camera. So that's why you need to pause or write down notes. One note would be, you must find your white balance setting, how to change that. And the second, what we're going to get to in a minute, will be ISO. You have to know how to change your ISO setting, and that's a practical for both of those, wide and artistic, but it's really a must. It's a basic of this of photography in general. Whether you're an amateur or professional, it really doesn't matter. It's a fundamental. So let's get right to white balance. Now with white balance, this is a film camera right here. This is just a cheap, relatively cheap film camera. And when you bought film back in the day, when I had film, or if you go somewhere and you see film, take a look. If it's color film, black and white will be different. But in color, it usually somewhere will say daylight. And most films were daylight that you would see at a department store, drugstore, grocery store. Most of those point and shoot throwaway cameras were daylight balanced. Now, to go to the, I don't want to confuse you too much, but there's a measurement that you can take of light temperatures, and the color of the light, let's say, which is the temperature. We go by temperature. The sun at the coolest that we typically would use in photography would be around 5,500 Kelvin, Kelvin, not Calvin and Hobbes, which is Calvin not with a C, but it's Kelvin. And Kelvin, an incandescent is the opposite for what we're going to use. Let's call it opposite because it's a warmer color versus a colder color. A blue, the symbol for the sun is often blue, and the incandescent is usually a warmer tone, orangey. And that's somewhere around 3,200, 2,800, 3,400, plus or minus. Those are the temperatures. which is a warmer color on a scale if you saw a scale. I know that's probably might be more than you need to know, but sometimes it helps to know that there's a reason. There's a reason why this all makes sense and why it exists. Basically, your eye does not tell you, you see things so clearly. You'll see a slight difference, like in this room I have incandescent over here, so you might see a warmer color on this shoulder, perhaps. And this is a daylight bulb here that I bounced off a wall to balance that light. I'll let there's daylight and incandescent come in there. So you should see maybe slightly bluer or a cooler color on this side, and probably a slightly warmer tone on this side. So film days, you would pick the film. In digital, you would actually go into your camera menu and you would actually push the buttons wherever it is on your camera, and you will set daylight, you will set tungsten or incandescent, which is usually the symbol of a light bulb. So if you're looking for incandescent, it doesn't say incandescent, it is actually a symbol of a light bulb, to make it simple. And you'll see the sun or clouds or even shade, which symbolizes shade, in your white balance menus. So the bottom line is, if you know what the color is, if it's daylight, you need to pick daylight. If it is incandescent, for sure, or the warm lights, pick it. You can also test. You can take a picture, and with digital, the advantage is you can actually see the results and compare and develop an eye for that. But you want to pick it, because if you just go auto white balance all the time, your pictures will not be consistent. You will not have the perfect skin tones. You might have a green cast or slightly different cast. It's much more complicated, and auto is just not going to be an answer that you're going to want to do unless you don't know, or the color. You're walking through a building, and you might have different colors coming in, right? You might have some daylight mixed with fluorescent and incandescent, or there's even sodium vapor, which is even warmer. So there are, you may have some funny colors, and auto is the last resort. First, pick the white balance that you know, if you know it, and typically you will know it because you're going to be outdoors a lot. When you go indoors, most homes are lit by incandescent colors. Not always. It could be daylight bulbs, but they're not as popular. People do like the warm color, actually. So you will find that probably more the norm in a light bulb, and usually they're cheaper, less expensive. Usually, sometimes you pay more for the daylight balance. So as a practical, white balance, change it, set it, find out where it is on your camera. That's just a basic must. So again, the choices are going to be, one thing that I'm going to try and teach you is practical and reality-based decisions, and then the artistic and creative-based decisions. White balance is really a reality. It's a practical. If you know what it is, pick it. It's just a reality of the situation. Now, how could that be artistic and creative? How could you make a choice that's creative and artistic? Maybe you want to maybe have a foggy scene. Maybe the scene is low light. Maybe it's in the woods. Maybe it's a lake. Maybe it's a brook going through the woods. Whatever it is, you will see from time to time these really blue tone photographs, right? Sometimes they're black and whites that are blued. Sometimes they're actually a scene that you photographed with a tungsten or incandescent white balance, the light bulb white balance, and that will turn everything blue. And that's in daylight. It will make a blue cast. In most scenes, it doesn't look good. It's irritating to look at. But in a mood shot, let's say you're doing a Sleepy Hollow little video or shot, type shot. Some of those scenes are very blue. And even in movies and film, they'll use the same techniques often, where they will just change the white balance sometimes, and maybe even filter it on top of that to get the tone, the color, the exact color of the blue they want, not just any random blue. And so that would be an artistic and creative decision to change that. So if you want to pause now, or if you're going to make a list, you have to find the white balance and understand how to change it in your camera. That's the basic. For me, I would, if I'm going outdoors, I would automatically set it to daylight, or in my case, I usually use cloudy white balance. The cloudy tends to be slightly warmer tones, so I'll do that. If I'm coming back indoors, I'm going to actually change it to incandescent. Incandescent if I know it's incandescent, and or auto if I don't know. Automatic, I'm going to do that right off the bat, is change the white balance. We're going to go now to ISO, and with ISO, that's another fundamental thing that is one of the first things you'll change is ISO. Now when you went to the store to buy the film in a grocery store or department store, you also bought it, you know, it usually came in like 100 ASA was the term used, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and 3200. Each of those is what's called one f-stop apart. It's one whole stop, which is 2 times the amount of light, which is a lot of difference. And as you went from 100, let's just say typically 100 would be the finest grain, the best tonal range, from white to black, highlight to shadow, or deep shadow. The best range usually was in the lower ISO films, the best quality. The less grain, that would make a bigger print and a better looking image. You would buy the 100 to 200, and that would be good for, say, outdoors for most things, maybe even in most sports until it got dark out, or if it was a very, very, very fast sport, something you really want to stop action on. Maybe you would go to, you know, it should work for that. So daylight film and lower ISO was probably the most popular, but then you had the 400s, the 800s, 1600s, and ISO, ASA, ISO can be interchangeable. ISO is more of the international standard terminology nowadays. You really won't see ASA mentioned, but some of my older students or people like myself that grew up in the film days would have only seen ASA, the writing of ASA, if you go far enough back. So the bottom line is, if you go as you need to raise it. If you're as a practical, you're going to raise it when you're outdoors, and your ISO, you're going to raise it in lower light. If it's getting lower light and you want to stop action, if you're shooting a soccer game and it's getting darker and darker, you're probably going to raise your ISO. In the film days, you would actually have to put in a whole faster film. You would actually have to either waste the film, the first roll you had, if you were shooting multiple things in a day. So it was more cumbersome in the film days. Nowadays in digital, you really can do it on the fly, and it's so easy to do. So you will have to find, like in this camera, on the surface I cannot change my ISO. I actually would have to go in to a menu on this camera, and it's so small it makes sense you would have to do that. But it may be annoying, but it's well worth your ability to research your camera and know your camera. It's just the practical there where you'll have to know how to find the ISO. So indoors, I'm coming indoors. I just shot my soccer game, and now I'm indoors, maybe a celebration or a birthday party or whatever. I'm probably going to raise the ISO because the light intensity is going to drop indoors. So I'm going to raise the ISO to maybe 800 ISO, maybe 1600. If my camera will make a good quality 1600 ISO image, then I will probably go to 1600 ISO. Maybe higher again if I need to, and if the camera can produce a good quality image. It kind of depends on how far that camera can be pushed and how fast your lenses are, and that's for another day. But for right now, you want to know your ISO and your white balance. If you want to think beyond the practical and the reality of situations for ISO, one creative use would be to use a really low ISO, as low as you can go, maybe even a neutral density filter on top of that. If you're shooting waterfalls, ideally you would shoot the waterfalls maybe in lower light, you know, towards dusk or sunrise. So the light is so low that with a low ISO, you can make the patterns of the water more into like brush strokes, right? As if say it's a 5-second or 10-second exposure, well, that water will be rushing through and bouncing and causing spray. It will turn into often into a milky pattern, you know, going through your scene, through your photograph, and that picture comes about by lowering your ISO because you don't want to freeze the water, and then it just looks normal. But once you what's used to call drag the shutter, it's a long shutter speed, you know, long exposure. So into seconds. Once you start going into seconds, then any movement will be ghosty, or if like water is a good example of it, will be building on each other. As that's going through, it's building, those tones are building through that scene and making it can even be almost a solid if you do it long enough, of water going through. So it's really fun and interesting when you do creative use of using your camera and your controls. So that would be an artistic. So something to keep in mind is you'll always have artistic choices and you have practical choices. But we're always going to start with the practical as you're learning, so that you understand the general nature of the thing. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, you want to pause and you want to really find that on your camera, the ISO. One thing about ISO is related to the triangle. I have a cold, so you might hear me sniffle and things. But one thing about ISO is related to your shutter speed also and your aperture, and how that's really, you'll often hear it called the triangle of exposure. That's a term that's been used for a long time, and it's basically the relationship between ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. This next part of the video, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this aperture to try and explain this quickly, and so you can get at least some kind of start of an understanding about this. This is a camera that has more of an old school aperture ring. This is called an aperture ring, right here. Not all cameras, as you see, like this one, have that, right? This doesn't have that, but it actually will change the aperture internally, right? It will change it electronically. This camera allows you the kind of old school way where you can set it on the camera and it will permanently at that moment be set to a certain aperture. Aperture is, picture a disc that opens and closes, It's a circle, it's a disc. Usually it's shutter blades, right? And, or blades, aperture blades. And it's kind of like how your eye works. If you go outdoors, your eye is going to close down, right? If you go indoors, your eye is going to open up to gather more light. That's how your eyes work. And the camera can do that automatically, I suppose, if you had it on auto. But aperture is something that you can set, on a lot of cameras. Some cameras maybe it'd be tougher to set on this camera, but most cameras have an aperture priority. Either the A on a Nikon, or a lot of cameras it's just called A for aperture. I think Canon might be AV. They use a V on some of their terminology. They're the only ones that use a V, and so that's a little confusing sometimes when you look at different cameras. But Canon just chose to do like an AV. But let's just call it aperture to be consistent with more brands for right now. And the aperture control. So basically when you buy a lens, you will be buying, this one is f1.4. This is a very fast lens. It's a fast lens. F2 is about an f-stop from 1.4. I believe it's a whole stop. So that will be a one-stop increment between 1.4 and f2. A popular one, actually 1.8, some lenses that you buy, like a 50mm, say for a Nikon or Canon or some of the other SLR cameras, will be 1.8. You'll see that a lot on 1.7. That's a very fast. That's called fast because it's a big opening. It just lets more light in. It's a big opening. And 2.8 you'll hear a lot. A lot of pro lenses are 2.8 or faster. And 2.8 is where you can shoot in low light, like sports or indoors, and you can use a reasonable shutter speed when you have a 2.8 lens. It's very fast. F4 is another stop. Now you're getting still usable in most situations, but a little bit slower. F5.6 is now getting into the point, if you buy a lens, most kit lenses go say 3.5 to 5.6. 5.6 is a little bit slow, a lot slow really, to be honest. You won't see very many pros using 5.6 lenses, at least in low lighting or indoors, because they're so slow, they're not practical for a lot of things. How you use a lens like that, though, just one tip right now, if I want to give you a tip, is if you have a kit lens, you just bought a great camera, but you have a kit lens, which is okay, be fine, is tend to use it on the widest zoom. Whatever the lens is, if it's if it's a telephoto zoom or just a normal zoom, use it on its widest setting, and that will be the that would be the largest aperture. That's a practical, right? It's going to be a larger aperture. And walk closer to your subjects instead of zooming in. If you walk closer and you're at the widest aperture, let's say it's 3.5 because that is kind of the normal, then you'll be better off in most situations. It'll just be better. If you're outdoors, certainly a lot of shots you're going to want to close it down, maybe even past 5.6. So you get a little bit more depth of field, a little bit more of a look sharp. Depth of field is probably beyond what I'm going to talk about in this video, but it's something that out there that I throw out there that you could actually Google right now if you wanted to, or stop and just Google that to see what does he mean about depth of field. But it's going to go too far if I go in that direction at the moment. So aperture is a key element of photography, and as artistic choices, as a practical, I just explained really the practical was you want to be more wider often than closed down, because often you're going to be in low light, or you're going to need the stopping action of a faster shutter speed, which is related to the aperture. Artistically, the wider you go for any given focal length is maybe a 50 millimeter is the actual lens that you pick, right? So if it's a telephoto lens, it's going to be a longer focal length, what we call focal length lens. So on a shorter lens, a wide or a moderate lens, like maybe even a 50 millimeter, 35 millimeter lens, those in 35 millimeter terms are not really wide. They're in the middle there. They're not really super wide. They're not telephoto, but they're often very fast lenses. And so you'll want to change that to a 1.4. Let's say if you can go 1.4, what's going to happen if you're taking this photo of a portrait or a thing or whatever it is at 1.4, if they're somewhat close to you, it will blur the background at 1.4 with a moderate lens. Not a lot of them are that fast, but even f2 or 2.8 will make a smooth blur of the background. That's more of an artistic decision, right? Artistic choice. It will tend to isolate the exposure to whatever you focused on. If you typically you want to focus on a person, you want to focus on their eyeball. You want their eye, at least one eye, maybe the eye closest to the camera, sharp. Typically, unless there's a reason that you want the other eye that works, compositionally and artistically. But if I'm going to focus on that one part of the person or subject, whatever the subject is, it will throw at a wide aperture, even f2 at 2.8. If I'm close enough, it will throw the background really out of focus, right? Make it a nice, soft, pleasing effect. And so that's something that is very common use is limited depth of field. It's called depth of field. It limits how much looks sharp in the photo. And typically whatever you focus on directly is the most sharp. That's why some cameras now, they have face detection and eye. The Olympus camera even has eye detection because you want usually the eye sharpest. And in sports or anything else, let's say 2.8 aperture, if the subject, the sport is close enough to you, it will blur, it will soften the background behind that person. If it's a soccer player, it will isolate them from the rest of the field instead of having them all blend in. Can be an artistic choice. It can be practical. Sometimes it's practical and artistic because the reality is you often shoot a longer lens wide open. That's kind of the normal. You would change that only if you want the scene is either farther away and you want more of the scene sharp. That might be a reason to do it. Like a scenic photo, a far away scenic, where you have a long lens to capture that hillside or whatever it is, foliage. You may want more depth of field in that case, and so then you would close down. So that would be a practical to maybe f8, f11. One tip is if you do ever get a real true wide angle lens, which is something wider, the equivalent of a 35 millimeter wider than maybe a 24 millimeter and wider, say 18 to 24. If you get a lens like that and you close down to f8, f5.6 at least, to maybe f11, but at least f8, you're going to get more of the scene will be sharp from foreground to background. If you're doing a real hardcore landscape, you might even go to f22 or or f11, f32. That will give more look sharp. To look sharp, there's a trade-off that if you go to f32, you usually, through diffraction, you actually sometimes lose a little bit of actual sharpness, but it will look like everything is in focus. So sometimes there's trade-offs, but that can be practical in a way, because landscapes you tend to want to see everything sharp, but it's also artistic decision to make everything look sharp. So aperture is a very useful tool. This camera, some cameras you may have limited choices of how to pick that. You may be able to pick at a couple stops. Some cameras like this one, you can use the whole lens, everything the lens offers, you can pick the whole entire range. This one goes 1.4 to f16. Some cameras go 32 to 6. Large format cameras will go f64. There used to be a group, if you want to Google it, called f64 group, because when they used big film and big cameras, the lenses were correspondingly longer focal lengths, and they wanted to get everything sharp. They would actually go down to f64 to really make sure the whole scene was sharp, especially a landscape. So ISO and aperture are related in the overall exposure, to make a correct exposure when you're taking a picture, to make a photograph. The next thing would be shutter speed. It's related. That's the last thing that's of a basic camera element is shutter speed. To use these, typically you're going to go to, you could go to manual if your camera allows you to go to manual. But you also, if you go to aperture priority, if you know you want it wide open or closed down a little bit, you just pick that in your aperture priority, and it will set the corresponding shutter speed. If you know how they both work, independent of each other, you can make decisions. Maybe you want to go to shutter priority. At the end of the day, you can get to the same spot whether you're on aperture or shutter. I pick aperture as to be consistent, and so I don't make a mental error if I'm really rushing. So I try to need to be consistent. I take a lot of pictures quickly, so I want to be consistent is one of my things and so I don't make a mental error. But you can go either way. It's not really. Actually, once you know one, I probably wouldn't even make the error. So it's simple concepts I'm going to explain. But shutter speed, how that works with your lens and your ISO. And ISO is basically the film sensitivity, or the sensitivity that you're setting for your sensor in your digital camera. So that's the sensitivity to light. Basically, the higher ISO you go, the more it's amplified, to be honest. So I'm adding a little bit more to what I said earlier, but not much more. I'm just expounding on it a little bit, and I don't want to confuse you. But so next thing is going to be the shutter speed. So say for any given shutter speed, if I'm on aperture and I'm on f2 in this camera, it may pick for the fun of it, it's saying a sixth of a second at f2 right here. It's very dark in here at ISO 200. Okay, so I just named three things, right? A sixth of a second, that's shutter speed, and that's most cameras will show you those numbers if you look carefully. Usually you can see those numbers being displayed somewhere. So a sixth of a second, I would have to use a tripod to take this picture. In this camera, I could actually open up one whole f-stop, and it would be half of that. It would be twice as fast as that, because it would be one f-stop is 2 times the light. So that's a little thing that I'm throwing out extra that you would